My sister showed up at my parents' house the week before my wedding and told me she was taking my dress for free. She said it like it was obvious, like the dress belonged to everyone who breathed in the same house. Her name is Claire. She's 5 years older than me, practiced at making other people feel wrong. She walked in, hugged my mother, and then turned to me as if she had forgotten the 2 years of deposits, fittings, and late-night emails with a seamstress in New Jersey. She pointed at the garment bag on the chair, where I'd left it, and she said, without any softness, "Give it to me." It hurt, because there's nothing private you plan for as carefully as a wedding dress. The satin felt like an account ledger in my hands. Every payment I had made, $200 for the sample, $20,500 for custom alterations, the non-refundable deposit the designer required, those numbers mapped onto decisions I'd already made, postponing a graduate course, the secondhand sofa I'd bought instead of the new one I wanted. The dress was the end of a long string of small sacrifices. For her to treat my life like a buffet item, grabbed, complained about, then consumed, cut differently than a normal fight. It was a trespass that started in the body of my plans and ended in the privacy of my hopes. I didn't tell the story that way at first. I said, "That's my dress." I said, "No." I said the usual things, which to her were just obstacles, not sentences. She laughed once, like a small sound to warm her coffee. Then she asked my mother to sign for her, and my mother, who always wants everyone to like each other, hesitated. That hesitation was the shape of the rest of that month. We had a family history that made leaving a confrontation like that costly. Claire had always been the rhetorician of the family, fluent in anger, practiced at persuasion. She'd taken over small managerial things with my parents without asking their cable plan, doctor to call, their passwords. She ran errands for them, and over time, the errands leaned toward authority. She had a job that paid better than mine because she'd moved into tech. She had been able to convince my parents her help was a kind of love. I wasn't asking for estrangement when I refused. I was asking for my day, my dress. But the people who were supposed to protect me had already been told Claire's version of me, slow, indecisive, the one who needed guidance. I still lived in my parents' house then, rent-free, a small mercy while I finished a contract and tried to save for a home. My fiancée Danielle worked the late shift at the hospital. We had a date set for 3 weeks out. Nothing about any of that was extravagant. I had chosen a midweek venue to keep costs down, borrowed chairs from a church, and planned to buy the cake from the bakery that gave a student discount. The dress was the one thing that felt uncompromised. It had been mine, paid for in small, careful pieces of my life, and in an hour, Claire acted like the money didn't matter, like the labor and time and the story of me choosing that dress meant nothing compared to her entitlement. When she demanded it, she said she needed it for presentation at a fundraiser. She was organizing for a local charity she'd only started telling us about 3 months earlier. She said it was a good cause. The offer was performative and impenetrable, her favorite kind. If Claire asked for something in the name of public service, she expected no questions. I didn't want to make her an enemy in front of my mother, so I tried to deflect. I said, "I need it for the wedding." She said, "You'll have another dress." My mother said, "Maybe she's right, honey. Maybe you can get something else." That's when I realized the real weapon Claire used. She shifted the conversation away from what she wanted and toward the questioner's legitimacy. If you asked enough, you could make someone doubt their right to keep something that had already been arranged. At the first escalation, she called me late that night. 12 rings, the kind of call that makes you pick up because you imagine an accident. She said, "Just give it to me and we'll all move on." When I asked what moving on looked like, she told me the story of a woman she'd known who didn't have time to do these things. She framed my refusal as selfish. She sent me a text later pretending to be conciliatory. "I'm trying to keep peace." And then 3 minutes later, she forwarded a photograph of herself in a dress at a charity gala with the caption, "Imagine you in this, but with more money." The implication was precise. She would be the one who benefited from the attention that dress brought, and I would be the one left to explain why I had said no. The next escalation was the seamstress. I had worked with a woman named Rosa for 8 months. She had taken my measurements over 3 visits, insisted on an extra fitting, and had a gentle way of insisting things would work. Rosa knew the deposit schedule and the non-refundable fees. She also knew Claire. Somewhere in the middle of the process, Claire had offered her a favour to alter another dress for free, and Rosa had accepted. When Claire showed up at Rosa's shop that week and told her she needed a dress for a thing, Rosa softened. Claire leaned on that softness and began making promises about future business, promises for everything from bridal alteration to community theatre costumes. Claire was, by then, a promised client. Rosa had smiled and said, "I can help," and then texted me with an apology that read like a band-aid. "I want to be fair to you, but I'm short on staff this week." I remember the way the air tightened when I read that text. Each small crack expanded. My fiancé tried to call me and I put the phone on silent because the sound of his voice made everything feel like a test. I might fail. He called again and this time I answered. He asked what I needed. I couldn't tell him the truth. The truth sounded like whining out loud, and we had already been scraping by for months. I said, "I'm okay. I'll figure something out." He said, "If you want, we can just pick out the dress together next weekend." It was a helpful fantasy. It was also a decision I couldn't make because the timeline had been set. The designer needed a final measurement. The deposit was paid. I felt my choices collapsing into other people's narratives. The pressure increased. Claire started bringing my mother small gifts. A plant, a book, a package of specialty tea. She did it in a way that called them attention, then quickly made the offering casual. Mum was taken. She began to see Claire as someone who fixed things. Mum believed she was noble. She liked a hero. And in an hour, she began to repeat Claire's phrases in the kitchen while emptying the dishwasher. "Claire has so much to do," she said in a tone that sounded like an excuse. "She's always doing things for the community." My mother's approval was the currency Claire wanted, and textiles were the smallest denomination. One afternoon, I found a message from Claire on our family group chat. It read, "We're all choosing peace. I'll borrow the dress for the gala. You can have mine in return." She attached a photo of an off-the-rack dress from a discount shop. The message was public and performative. She knew my wedding guests might read it. She knew Daniel, who favoured simplicity, would find it acceptable. She was shifting the moral field again. If she offered a dress in exchange, she framed herself as generous. I tried to reply in a level voice. "You offered to help me once. The deposit is non-refundable. I need it." She wrote back in the family chat, "You'll be fine." The chat thread closed with a few thumbs up emojis from cousins who didn't know the whole story. The next escalation was more personal and more humiliating. Claire invited my fiancé to lunch without telling me. They met at a diner near the hospital where Daniel worked overtime. Daniel told me about it later, awkward, and read over the phone, as if embarrassed that something happened he hadn't vetted with me. Claire had told him she's making a fuss about a dress. If you can be reasonable, you two can save a lot of money. What he didn't understand fully was how those words landed. In Claire's telling, I was the problem, tempted by vanity, expensive in ways I could not afford. Daniel, who had spent nights on call and had watched the numbers in our bank account become a small, tight thing, heard the word money and thought of spreadsheets and practicality. He didn't side with her in an explicit way. He simply started asking questions I didn't want to answer about whether the dress was worth it, whether we could postpone, whether we could do something less showy. It felt like pressure from both sides, family and fiancé. It was a slow, grinding undermining. I began to think of the dress as a fragile promise that required confessing and defending. When you are defending a thing you already paid for, the defense itself changes you. You start to calculate how to speak, what to omit. I remember standing in my room one night and taking the garment bag down from the closet and smelling the fabric like someone taking the pulse of a fever. I measured the space in my life that could still be mine and found it thinning. My reaction at first was to resist politely, to speak in the tone my mother liked, the measured voice that kept emotions in their expected places. But resistance requires energy. And Claire had more than I did. She could call my mother, flood the conversation with concern, and always keep the moral frame. I want what's best for our family. She could prod the seamstress, promise business, and then I would be the one who refused to see the bigger picture. When I said no, I started to notice a pattern. People who used to offer help began to hesitate, as if they didn't want to take a side. The bank of goodwill that had once sat in my name began draining in small, invisible transactions. A cancelled babysitting arrangement here, a returned favour there. The dress, meant to be a gift for a life ceremony, mutated into a ledger item showing how unpopular I had become. A month in, the escalation loop tightened into a concrete threat. Claire told Mom she needed the dress for a speaking engagement at a women's network. She said she'd found a donor who would pay for alterations and cover costs. My mother, anxious to keep peace, suggested mediation. I suggested, in a voice that felt both desperate and small, that I could lend the dress for the evening if Claire paid for dry cleaning and insisted it be returned by Monday. She agreed to borrow it and then sent me a short text. "I'll pick it up Friday, don't worry." That night, I packed the dress into a heavier bag and slipped a note into the pocket with a polite instruction. Emergency contact for the seamstress, return date, and a reminder that the deposit was non-refundable. The note was a modest attempt at protection. Friday came. Claire did not. Saturday night, a car honked outside the house late. I opened the blinds just enough to see her in the driveway, arms full of boxes, and a girlfriend I'd never met. She asked for the dress again in front of my father, who was reading the paper on the porch and squinted at the exchange like a spectator. He shrugged. She leaned into my mother's sympathy and said, "We're organizing something important. You'll be so proud." This is when the humiliation turned into a threat. Claire reached for the garment bag as if she had the right to take it, and my father didn't say no. I took a step forward, the kind of step that reads as final in the quiet of a porch at midnight. I said plainly, "Claire, that's my dress." The difference between saying no and saying that's mine is the difference between an argument and a claim. Claire blinked like I had stepped out of my role. She asked why I was being difficult. The friend with her laughed. I felt sudden, hot embarrassment. My face must have looked as tight as my hands. Claire left that night with the boxes, but not the dress. She called me the next day and left a voicemail. "You can't keep doing this. You're being petty about material things." She used the word petty as if it were an objective diagnosis. The consequences began in small, real ways. Rosa, who had the final adjustment scheduled, said she could no longer guarantee the seamstress work because of the confusion. The designer in New Jersey called and said she'd received a complaint and wanted to make sure everything was legitimate. Daniel's parents, who had been looking forward to coming to the wedding, called to ask how serious we were about the date. The people who had planned to help with setup started to make different plans. Your friend's behavior shifts slowly. At first, it's small, someone doesn't RSVP, but then someone else blocks the date from their calendar and calls in favors for their life that week. Social energy is a domestic animal. When it senses instability, it leaves. My reaction hardened. Each small collapse taught me how fragile the network around me was. When your family begins to tell a story about you that you cannot speak over, resistance becomes a series of actions rather than words. I started making lists, names to call, receipts to find, people who knew the history of the dress. I took photos of the receipt, the contract with the designer, the email chain that included 2 deposits made from my account. I printed a copy of the bank transfer and left a folder in my room labelled in my handwriting, "Wedding, important." That folder felt like a private file within a house that was closing itself off. Then, the next loop of escalation came the day the dress went missing from the upper hall closet where I had left it for safekeeping. I went to check the side seam for a pin I'd left for Rosa and found nothing. The garment bag was gone. I called my mother. She said she had seen Claire carrying a bag that morning to her car. There was a split second between hearing that and realizing what that meant. I asked my mother to call Claire, and my voice shook. There was a scramble of ordinary justifications. She said she'd borrow it. But the feeling in my body was not about the fabric. It was the sensation of a boundary being removed without consultation. When someone takes something you expected to be returned, they also take from you the expectation that agreements matter. My reaction then became less about asking and more about deciding. I could call the police. I could storm over to Claire's house with my father and demand it back. I could beg. Each of those felt like a gamble in a field where the dice were marked. I thought of the possibility of making things worse, of producing a family scandal. In the days before I would have stood in front of 80 people reading vows. I thought of the wedding photos with my mother looking like a woman at war with her daughter. I tried to weigh the cost and found that the numbers on the page were small compared to the atmosphere their dispute would produce. Instead, I did something quiet and odd. I sold it. The sale was not a messy, vengeful act. It was the only thing I could imagine that would both take the object out of Claire's reach and provide a resource for me. I listed the dress online in a private auction with an account under my own name, including the receipt and the alteration history and one photo that showed the hem in the sunlight. I priced it above what I had paid, not out of greed, but out of calculation. If I could get enough, I would have money to leave the house with dignity, to rent a small place, to change the power dynamics that had put me at Claire's mercy. I put a reserve that would cover the non-refundable costs and leave me a small cushion. I wrote a short, factual description, custom-made, paid in full, available for immediate pickup. I set the auction for 5 days. I did not tell Claire. I did not tell my parents. The sale felt like an act of reclaiming agency in a family economy that had begun to work in reverse. By putting it up for sale, I was saying the dress was no longer a battleground. It was a thing I could turn into a new beginning. In my head, the transaction was only between me and an anonymous buyer. The reality was messier. The escalation continued. Claire discovered the listing through a family friend who forwarded it with a short note. "Is this the dress?" She sent me a message with a string of exclamation points, then a call. Her voice moved through tones I did not like, indignant, then pleading. She asked me to take the sale down. She texted my mother and asked if she had authorized me to sell family property. My mother, already exhausted, replied that she didn't know. The phone calls multiplied. Daniel sat on the edge of our bed the night I put the package for shipping into a plain box and taped it shut. He wanted to be angry on my behalf. He wanted a fight with Claire that would be clean and cathartic. I didn't want a fight that would make my wedding a family show. When the auction closed, the final bid was enough to cover the deposits and the moving van for a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that would require compromise, but offered privacy. The buyer was a woman from Ohio who wrote a note about wearing it for her daughter. The payment cleared. I took the cash and, in a way that felt clinical, put it in an envelope and left it on the kitchen table for my mother to see, written in my handwriting, "For deposit refund, moving." I left a printed copy of the receipt in the folder that had been labelled "Wedding Important." It felt like a small, bureaucratic measure to make my action visible as legitimate. What changed after the sale was immediate and complicated. Claire's calls increased in frequency and in volume. She alternated between accusing me of theft and accusing me of being sentimental and selfish. She told my father she would take this to the court if necessary. My father, who had been lazy in arguing almost all his life, suddenly found a vector to please Claire. The house became a tribunal. My mother cried in the linen closet, and when I found her, she asked me with a voice as small as an apology whether I had to do it. I told her that I had to do something that would make me feel like I had the option to leave. That truth hit the softest place in her, and she turned away. Then came the turning point. It was not a speech or confession, it was a receipt. I had left the printed bank transfer in the folder by accident, the same printed item that showed my payment schedule. Claire, in her anger, had rifled through my things, looking for anything that would boost her claim. In the process, she exposed something else, a bank notice that had been mailed to my mother's address but billed to Claire's joint account as utility management. It was a bank statement that showed a series of transfers from Claire's account to an account labeled Parents Medical and another labeled House Repairs. There was nothing explicitly criminal in the transfers. On paper, they were Claire's payments to services, but one line on the statement had an annotation I had never seen. Transferred funds, Dad's account access set year 9 to 14. When I read that line, I felt something shift. It suggested that Claire had been quietly moving money and establishing authority over my parents' accounts. I called the bank on a weekday while Daniel was at work and spoke with a clerk who was helpful enough to say, "If you suspect undue influence, there are forms." The word undue sounded like a legal hinge. I took a printout of the line and the email chain I had saved with Claire's earlier promises and marched with shaking hands to the local branch the next day. The bank clerk listened and asked me to fill out forms about power of attorney and account access. She said there were procedures in place to investigate. I felt foolishly relieved. The bureaucracy itself felt like a weapon. It required time and paperwork, not the kind of theatrical confession Claire was skilled at avoiding. The forms gave me the ability to request an official audit of transfers. It was not a promise of justice, but it was a mechanism to pull something private into public scrutiny. And Claire feared that more than anything. When I brought the bank's notice to my parents, it created a pivot that changed how my mother viewed Claire. She had trusted Claire like a neighbour, like someone who would never break trust. But the word audit in a bank letter is a freckle that grows into suspicion. My mother, who had been reluctant to question her older daughter, suddenly asked questions Claire could not answer without sounding careless. Claire, when confronted, grew defensive. She claimed the transfers had been made with their knowledge. She said, "I'm looking after them." But the bank investigation progressed slowly, and in doing so, turned Claire's cloud of moral superiority into paperwork that required signatures and explanations. That quiet bureaucratic pivot gave me leverage I hadn't had before. It didn't return the dress. It didn't repair the months of humiliation. What it did was make it less likely Claire could continue to act unilaterally. The potential of an audit meant Claire had to be publicly accountable for actions she had treated as personal favours. She lost the easy advantage of private persuasion. And in the way institutions work, public scrutiny often shrinks the space where entitlement can hide. The consequences after the turning point were realistic and constrained. The bank's investigation required time. Claire withdrew from several committees because her board asked for clarity on her finances. My mother stopped asking me to prove things in front of her the way she had been doing. The house became quieter, but there were losses that did not heal and could not be rewound. My relationship with my family changed in ways that were permanent. Invitations stopped arriving for holiday dinners that used to be rituals. Claire called me once, months later, and left a voicemail that said, "I didn't think you would actually sell it." There was no apology in her voice. There was only the small, cold note of someone who had expected power and had not received it. The wedding did not happen as planned. Daniel and I spoke in a different tone after all that. He was supportive of my decision to sell the dress and move out. But the energy in him that had once been future-focused became cautious. We postponed. We decided to use the money from the dress to secure a small apartment and to pay for a modest ceremony later. One where the guests would not be the family who had watched the lines between us harden. The choice to postpone was not romantic. It was practical. It reflected the way we wanted to enter a marriage without an air of crisis clouding the day. Selling the dress had other consequences, softer and more private. The woman who bought it sent me a note after the wedding, months later, telling me it had fit her daughter perfectly and that she had felt beautiful wearing it because of the care I'd put into it. That message was a small consolation. It was not the same as having my mother by my side while I zipped up the back, but it was human and sincere in a way Claire's performative offers had never been. I moved out with the money from the sale. I rented a small apartment that had a front window and a cheap couch. I bought a toaster. I learned how to be more deliberate about setting boundaries. There were nights when guilt pressed at me, memories of my mother's quivering voice in the closet, the image of her apologizing. But those nights were interleaved with others of quiet autonomy, paying the first month's rent, receiving a utility bill in my own name, choosing who I wanted in my life. Claire and I grew stranger to one another, not the kind of estrangement driven by violence, but a softer disciplinary distance. She called on my birthday that first year and we spoke for 7 minutes. She asked about small things, how the apartment looked, whether I missed my old job. Her voice carried the air of someone testing the temperature of a river they had once walked across. I answered plainly. No apologies were traded. No details of the bank's findings were discussed on the call. We were both, in our separate ways, tending to the new borders. The last scene in that chapter of my life was not dramatic. I stood in my empty bedroom in the apartment I had moved into with the money from the sale, and I watched a dress bag hang in the corner. It was empty. I kept one photograph of the original garment on my dresser, a small proof that I had chosen something beautiful for myself once. I did not grieve the dress so much as grieve the version of myself who expected people to keep their promises. Grief, I learned, is practical. You hold it, fold it, and then you decide whether to pack it or set it aside. There were legal consequences for Claire later, not the courtroom drama I had feared, but paperwork and checks and an eventual agreement that clarified who could manage accounts. The bank's procedures had limitations. They could not force restitution for the dress, nor did anyone jail her for a moral claim. But the audit closed with recommendations and with a new formal oversight on how the family's accounts would be managed. That structural change mattered more than the dress. It mattered because we had replaced opaque favors with signatures. If I'm honest, I still ache over parts of it. I miss the idea of the wedding that once felt simple. My friends, the 4 chairs my aunt would have borrowed, the cake we would have cut with servers who knew my name. I miss a version of my mother who would have stood at my shoulder without hesitation. I miss the person I had been before I had to become a little harder and a little more suspicious, but I don't regret selling it. That decision was an instrument, not a spectacle. It rebuilt a margin where I could breathe. It afforded me a chance to make other plans where my consent mattered. The money didn't fix everything. It didn't repair the months of small cruelties or make Claire less inclined to assume the world owed her things. What it did was tilt the balance by a few degrees. Those degrees were enough to give me options. I tell this story now because people sometimes imagine that ceremonies are neutral ground, that a dress is only cloth and lace. They're not. Objects carry histories and expectations, and sometimes the people around them reveal their true preferences when confronted with someone else's boundary. If you've ever been in a room where someone else casually treats your life as theirs to borrow, you know the small panic that sits in your throat when you realize you can't rely only on words anymore. At the end, when the dust had settled, my wedding happened quietly a year later. It was not in a church, not on a scheduled Saturday in front of every neighbor and cousin. It was an afternoon at a city park with 20 people who had stayed. I wore a simple dress I bought on sale, something that felt like me. My mother sat in the third row and wiped her eyes with a tissue she unfolded with care. Claire did not come. She sent a text. "Hope it's lovely." That was the closest she came. I don't tell you this for moralizing. I tell you because there's a small steadiness that comes from making a choice to stop being carried by other people's expectations. If you imagine revenge, imagine instead a quiet accounting, receipts, transfers, a small apartment, a child who later tries on a dress and smiles. That is the order of how things wound down. It's not cinematic, it's domestic. It is, in the end, how you make room for your life. If you stayed for the whole thing, thank you. If something in this resonates, please leave a like and subscribe for more stories. I'd love to hear, have you ever had to give something away to get yourself back? Leave a comment if you want to share.